How many of y'all were here for the Metaxas event last night? Put your hand up so I can kind of straw poll you. Yeah, did you appreciate it? Would you give the Lord a hand for that if you were blessed? I did. For those of you that saw that, had you read his book, any of his books before? How many of you had actually? I realize I'm putting you on the spot. Do you read books? Have you read a book? We're not big on reading a lot of books other than the Bible. The Bible is our book. But Eric Metaxas is famous for having. He is famous for the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so he had become famous for that, and then as anyone who does extensive history, in his biography of Bonhoeffer is in-depth, it is well-researched, and it is well-presented, it is carefully laid out and accurately, as near as I can tell, and it betrays some theological depth. And so it was natural then for him to begin to draw parallels between Bonhoeffer's patriotism and the needs of America today. And so there's been a resonance between Metaxas in his work and patriots. And so Eric Metaxas ended up with a radio show, and he's ended up on a speaking circuit, and that speaking circuit led him to us through a series of events. And so we were blessed to be able to have him here last night. And even last night, he only scratched the surface of really a pretty compelling and incisive ministry. But I kind of wanted to see if anyone wanted to do some reflecting on that tonight, because I have some stuff. I have thoughts. Because I've read some of the Bonhoeffer biography, and I've read more than his stuff about Bonhoeffer. I also am very interested in his book, Letter to the American Church, which is in my library, and it's also in Pastor Paul's library. And that was basically Eric Metaxas's sort of, if he wanted to give us a takeaway from the Bonhoeffer biography, it was that. It was his kind of moral of the story, if you will. And Letter to the American Church is a gut punch. It is a hard-hitting epistle. It's not quite as if Paul Van Noy were to write a letter to the American church, but I wish it had been, and that's really almost what I want to talk about. Is there are ways in which the way Eric Metaxas set the table for us is very good, but as any Candlelight member and attender would note, we have questions. We have things we wish that would be answered even more completely and even more carefully. So let's see. I wonder how I want to do this. Let me actually read a couple of quotes from the book to set the table for us, and then I'm going to go from there. And one would have thought that I would have worked out how to use my telephone. I keep thinking about my granddad, who was a Bell telephone guy, the year that he died in 1973, and he was enthralled with telephone and long distance technology. If only he could see what a phone is now today. Let me start from the back end, and I'll start from the very end of his letter to the American church. This is the hour for which each of us has been born. If we fully live in that freedom for which Christ has set us free, we will see God's hand in ways we might not dare to imagine. We will see miracles small and great. We will see not only revival, but reformation. We will see the goodness of God make its way into everything we do, because that is God's will for us and the world at this time. Now, this is Eric Metaxas at the end of his letter to the American church. Many who do not yet know the God we claim to worship will see how we live and will want to know him and will come to know him and will become part of what he's doing in our generation. Dare we believe that? Or are we already headed to the caves, believing that nothing we do can matter, and the judgment is falling and all we can do is save ourselves? So you who are the church, for it is not an institution, but a collection of each of us Christians in direct personal relationship with God. You who are the church are responsible in this. You. It does not happen apart from you, and it cannot happen apart from you. God looks to you now and you alone. He has put history and the future in your hands. In the end, you cannot look to your pastors or leaders, but to God himself. He will lead you in this, and you will either let him lead you or you will not succeed. He created you for a relationship with himself, and although he will use your pastors and leaders in helping you along this journey, he cannot do so unless you yourself take the ultimate responsibility in this. It is with you that he wants to deepen personal relationship. He created you for that, and your life can never be what it is meant to be unless you know that and step into it without fear. This is the very tail end of Letter to the American Church, and his inspiration for all these questions was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran German pastor. Maybe you have heard of him. Even if you haven't read these books, maybe you have heard this quote: when Christ calls a man, he calls him to come and die. Talking about dying with Christ. The Cost of Discipleship was the book for which I suppose Bonhoeffer was most famous. Bonhoeffer was famous for having led what is called the Confessing Church in Lutheran Germany, a church that, in contrast to the mainstream church, was out of step, out of sync, and out of tune with Hitler's regime. And so I think it is Metaxas' estimate that I can't remember the numbers now. The total out of the total number of pastors, there was a bell curve on the "We Love Hitler" end, 3,000, and then 3,000 in the Confessing Church. Thank you, Stephen. You should just come up here and help me with this. 3,000 Hitler robots and 3,000 confessing Christian patriot pastors. Okay? And so Bonhoeffer became known as chief among these. And Bonhoeffer he viewed himself, if you read his writings and you read about him, he viewed himself as an heir of Martin Luther. He viewed himself as a consummate German Christian in the highest and most godly sense of what Germany historically had been in its Christian influences. So in that sense, too, for Eric Metaxas, Bonhoeffer was and is a model for Americans today, because for what it meant for Bonhoeffer to be a patriot was to call a nation back to its godliest of roots, which for him meant back to the Bible and back to the God of the Bible. And Bonhoeffer lived this out as a pastor. He called out those pastors on the far end and the pastors in the middle who were not walking in step with this call. Famously, one of those pastors in the middle, by the name of Martin Niemöller, and I'm trusting that you can use the Google and or your paper library. Can anyone still use a card catalog? Do they even have a card catalog at the library anymore? That's all gone. Martin Niemöller is famous for having later come around to the position that he should have had during Bonhoeffer's life, but late. And Niemöller, I think, was famous for when they came for them, I didn't stand up because I wasn't one of them, and they came for the next group, and I didn't stand up because I wasn't part of that group either, and then another group, and another group, and another group, and when they came for me, there was no one left to stand with me. Bonhoeffer was the original. Bonhoeffer was martyred, and off the top of my head, I can't remember if it's correct that he was strung up with a piano wire or he was shot. I've read both. I can't remember if it's a dispute about which way he actually ended, because it's murky, but we know that he died in the hands of the Hitler regime. And we know that he was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. a Christian pastor involved in a plot to actually take direct action against perhaps one of the foremost tyrants of Western history. And of course, this is all of interest to Eric Metaxas, who has talked about American exceptionalism. He's talked about self-government. He's talked about the necessity of fighting tyranny. And all of this resonates with Candlelight, right? Has anyone ever heard the phrase sic semper tyrannis? Thus always with tyrants, and it is not a good ending for tyrants. So what's the problem? There isn't any problem except that some of the questions for Eric are tough ones. Yesterday, actually, I sent Sarah a couple of them because I wanted my questions answered. I wonder if I can, but one of them that I sent Sarah was actually asked by one of the pastors yesterday. And I guess I want to ask you, I'm going to basically put it like this. Have you all ever wondered about the details of the biblical basis for fighting tyrants? Fighting tyrants. I'll put it another way. Given Romans 13, submit yourselves before God to every authority among men. For there is no authority except that which is instituted by God. Romans 13. So we're familiar with some of this. You guys have heard Pastor Paul teach on Romans 13, and you have also probably remember Dan Wilson from Oklahoma coming here with the Black-Robed Regiment talking about the proper context for Romans 13, in which we understand that authority instituted by God is actually instituted to promote and uphold what is right and punish what is wrong. And if a government reverses that, then they are not subject to the command that they be obeyed under God anymore. In fact, one might argue, and historically the American founders argued, that Christians become duty-bound to resist such inversions. In other words, if someone who has been installed by God to uphold the right and to punish wrongdoers begins instead to punish the right and to uphold wrongdoers, then it is the duty of Christians to resist that. But how far? Are we to seize the opportunity to become involved in a plot to assassinate an evil dictator? And so this was the question posed by one of the pastors at Pastor Paul's pastor's lunch yesterday, that was hosted by the Idaho Family Policy Center, and at which Eric Metaxas took questions. One of the questions was basically this. Let me see if I can find the one I sent in for Sarah. Unless, Sarah, do you want to read it? Do you have it right there?
Metaxas kept talking about self-government and freedom last night, and the only Christian context it sounded like he really gave was generic Christian faith. He did mention a golden triangle of freedom, virtue, and faith. Can someone elaborate on this? Or is it the other question?
Well, both of those, something like that was asked as well. The golden triangle question I also had never heard of until yesterday. The golden triangle is essentially a circular action between three corners: faith, virtue, and liberty. And Eric Metaxas attributed this to Os Guinness, who's one of my favorite Christian apologists and a philosopher. And he has a British accent, which I can't copy, but... And I don't know, the only place I know of that this is cited was in a position paper, I think from the 80s, and it's only been elaborated in various blog posts, and I can't cite the source for this, but I know that Eric described it fairly well. The idea is that you need three, I'll just use a stool instead of a triangle. You need three legs to the stool of any godly society, and one is faith, and one is freedom, and one is virtue, and they reinforce each other, or they They are in motion together. They follow each other and or pull each other, and they're integral to each other. And so faith cannot be upheld properly without freedom. Freedom cannot continue to exist properly without virtue, and virtue cannot continue to develop in a people without faith, because as born-again believers, we know that faith comes through the gospel. Faith is a matter of salvation by grace alone, through faith. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, as described in the Scriptures alone, to the glory of God alone. Amen. Sometimes I just need to recite the whole thing to get it all right. And so the interlocking nature of those three corners of the triangle is probably understandable to us, and it is confirmed by the sentiments of the Founding Father, by which, and I think I'm probably about to reference Madison correctly, when he described the necessity of a virtuous people for the Constitution. I think he compared the Constitution to a net and said that a people without virtue would break through it like a whale. In other words, something like a Constitution is designed for people with the faith to allow God to produce virtue among them, the virtue to actually protect liberty and embody it through upright behavior, and the freedom enjoyed by such faith and virtue. And all of that can only exist among a virtuous people. And so this is what the Golden Triangle is talking about. As far as the context in which Eric Metaxas is talking about resistance to tyranny and self-government and liberty, I've kind of got a lot of my own ideas for that, and I'm not going to mention the doctorate that I earned that I'm still a little bit bitter about, because once I found out that I could have bought a boat with that money, or actually more accurately, maybe put a down payment on a house. And I mean a down payment because in some parts of the country, $70,000 or $80,000 might have bought me a house, but not here. So instead, I studied apologetics, and one layer of specialty was this. It was the role of the Bible in American apologetics, especially historically. And it is a very interesting topic. If you were to read into primary sources with me, including the Bible, you would find yourself very familiar with a lot of it. You would find that you already have a master's degree in a lot of this material yourself because you go to Candlelight, and or you've drifted into Candlelight from similar precincts. But I'm going to start with 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 9. And I'm going to do a little bit of just opining for a minute and then put it back into context of Eric Metaxas, and then see if you guys have any questions about this. And what I want you to try to do for the next little while is prove me wrong. I'm going to open the Bible now, and I'm going to start to expound on the Bible. I'm going to put it back in the context of all this, and I want you to be ready to test me. I want you to see if I'm making an error here. So turn, if you want to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 9. And somewhere in here at the right moment, Sarah, I'm going to ask for that second question because it will become appropriate. And you'll be immediately familiar with this account. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 and following. Now it came to pass, when Samuel was old, and this is Samuel, the last of the judges of Israel, and the first known identified prophet who was also a judge, if I recall correctly. When Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, make us a king to judge us like the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." And I'll just read verse 9 too. "Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." Now, I'm going to submit to you a fact of history that you may not know, and I have a book up here as evidence. This is Political Sermons of the Founding Era from 1730 to 1805. This is volume 1 of 2. It is microprint. It is dense and thick and heavy, and this book it could be you could throw it in the back of your pickup and it would keep you from skidding on the snow. This is a compendium of the thoughts of the Baptist, Anglican, Congregationalist, Puritan, Quaker, Presbyterian, and that's about it, really. There were some other assorted groups, but early in the founding, there's really about 4 main branches of Calvinist political philosophers who were preachers. Not all of them subscribed to Calvinism theologically, but they were almost uniformly, to a number that's been estimated by historians to be about anywhere from 80 to 90% of the colonists from the years 1730 to about 1805, politically and philosophically, they were Calvinists in all of these denominations. And what that meant was a handful of things. Calvinism meant that only Jesus could be king. That's number one. Calvinism meant that no human being could righteously rule because all humans are fallen and sinful. Calvinism meant, therefore, that any government instituted among men needed to concentrate on limiting the influence and authority of sinful fallen men so that the authority of a righteous and holy God could fully be exercised by God himself. Calvinism further meant politically, philosophically, that for this to happen, the people needed to uphold from the ground up a morality that protected God's rule, limited man's rule, and did so with a charter. Finally, Calvinism meant that I guess there's 2 final points. Calvinism meant that charter would basically be biblically derived and that it would be enforced by the will of the people through representative government. And all of this, when you read their sermons, it was everywhere. It was in the air and water. They would listen to these preachers in the evenings and on the weekends instead of watching TV or getting on the internet or. This was entertainment for them. This was their bread and butter and their water to drink and their air to breathe. And as I said, this was arguably by historians, not professors, not pastors, not even Christians. Historians have acknowledged that this mindset occupied up to 80% of the American colonists from these years, 1730 to 1805. And so the other piece that you notice as you start to read these is that these pastors, they were preaching these sermons in local assemblies. They were preaching them in town halls. They were preaching them in court. They were preaching them in Congress as it came to be. These pastors were everywhere, and they were listened to, and they were trusted. And so the core philosophical Calvinist concept was that self-government is godly, and self-government fights tyranny so that godly self-government can continue to happen. And this is a Jasonism. This is me regurgitating it my own way. I'll just give some exhibits really quick because Eric Metaxas has been asked about these items, and I'm just going to touch base on them a little bit and then see if you guys can test me on some of it. There are several exhibits to this. The first, I'm going to title my thoughts this way. I can't remember what's on the screen. Jason Talon does my PowerPoints now, and they always look better than what I was going to do. Metaxas Bonhoeffer is the same today as Bonhoeffer's, but it's a little different. As Metaxas has admitted himself, America is not Germany. And yesterday at Paul's Pastor's Lunch, he basically said it like this: we've got the founders. Bonhoeffer didn't have that. He had Martin Luther, and he had German history, and so there's a poverty to that. But we have George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and two of those names I mentioned, you've heard them touted as deists. That is wrong. All of these men believed in what I'm going to call a kingdom-deferred self-government. And the odd thing is that this Calvinist political philosophy of kingdom-deferred self-government was agreed upon by the non-theologians. Thomas Jefferson, who was not a deist but was a Unitarian, hated Trinitarian speculation, and he hated speculation about miracles, and he was really kind of anti-organized religion. But Thomas Jefferson knew one thing. The only king he would ever accept on earth was Jesus himself. Now, it sounds weird to put it that way, but Thomas Jefferson revered Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas Jefferson was a red-letter dude before red-letter Christianity was a thing. Thomas Jefferson's political philosophy revolved entirely around the necessity of keeping people free so that Jesus can be their only ruler. And this was the case with all of these guys. And so when I call them kingdom-deferred self-government guys, what I mean is that not one of them, not one, would settle for rule by any one human being unless it was Jesus himself. And the differences between them all revolved around whether they actually believed that Jesus was ever coming to do that. And on the Candlelight end, on the theologically sound end, was Sam Adams, who was literally looking for a millennial kingdom and Jesus to reign at its head, as do we today. And in agreement with him was Elias Boudinot, the founder of I believe it was the American Bible Society, the first president of the Continental Congress. I'm getting into some details. I've got Stephanie Fetzer looking at me, and I'm realizing that she could probably teach some of these details. And I've got homeschool moms out there. Leslie Gerslauer is out there she's getting her questions ready. The one failure of a doctoral program is that you drill about 1,000 miles deep into a very narrow area, and you become a specialist in micro stuff. So I'm just going to get to it. American exceptionalism is something that Metaxas was asked about yesterday I don't know if he was asked about it last night, but he was asked about it at the pastor's lunch. And it's still a tough one to answer. Do you remember when one of our presidents said, well, yeah, I believe in American exceptionalism, just like I think the Greeks probably believe in Greek exceptionalism and the Russians believe in Russian exceptionalism. And do you remember that? Am I the only one that got that kind of burned in my memory? Oh, drama. Did I just say that on the live stream? Thank you, Craig. I think that was my friend Craig out there. American exceptionalism is widely misunderstood. It is not the idea that Americans are better than anyone else. It is not even the idea that America is better than anyone else. It is the establishable and provable notion that the American philosophical political system is exceptional. and is exceptional as demonstrably, historically provided by God as something nearly unique in history. And I say nearly unique in history because something that I would love to talk to Eric Metaxas about is his statement that America is the first time this has ever happened in history, and it's not quite. It's the first time it's taken off. It's the first time that it has become globally influential. It's the first time that it's become positioned to influence every government around the world and in succession, irrevocably. But American exceptionalism is a key part of this discussion. And so the founding fathers were the ones to define this. And our founding fathers, as noted, were all about kingdom-deferred self-government. And that is how we ended up with balance of powers. That's how we ended up with checks and balances. It's how we ended up with not only the Constitution, but its twin, the Declaration of Independence. And the founding fathers were all political, philosophical Calvinists, all of them. And so that brings me to Exhibit C, premillennial libertarian Calvinism. You need to understand that as Candlelight, that is what your political philosophy is. You may not know that, but that is what it is. That is what it is clinically, how it would clinically be described. You believe in Calvin's political philosophy, but you are premillennial about it because you do not want any king except Jesus on this earth. And you're libertarian about it because you know that we're not out here trying to create a theocracy and force people at the point of a gun to follow Jesus, because you know that God will draw people to Jesus. But what you want government to do is to protect the liberty of the life, liberty, and property of you and others. That is premillennial libertarian Calvinism, politically and philosophy, and that is what we are. This has been done 4 other times, and you may know about some of them. It was all Calvinists that tried it. They got it done for a while in John Calvin's Geneva. I have told Pastor Paul he is John Calvin and Kootenai County is Geneva, and he's getting used to hearing that from me. At first he bridled, at first he recoiled, at first he almost threw me out of the office because he thought I was calling him a Calvinist. John Calvin was a lawyer turned pastor in a city that had rebelled against the autocratic church rule of that city. And in the welter of political struggle that continued to happen in that city, John Calvin became the definer of self-government. And that created a representative republic that operated under a balance of powers, under a charter with popular rule and representation. And the charter was the rule of God as described in the Bible, but not foisted. Now you will hear and read and think that it was foisted theocratically on Geneva, but that's only because everybody was doing that at the time. But Calvin was the first one to dial it back. And so you'll hear about the execution of Servetus. Yes, everyone got executed if they went against enough ecclesiastic authorities loudly enough. But that was everywhere. Calvin was the first one to actually see a representative republic set up as a formal government. But it also happened in Cromwell's England, another group of Calvinist political philosophers who happened to be Puritans. It happened in John Knox's Scotland. Scotland is, to this day, kind of a little-known political example of this kind of government. And, by the way, not incidentally, sent many immigrants to the United States in the wake of our colonists, further cementing the Calvinist political revolution in America. Let's see, I said it was John Cromwell's England, it was Geneva, it was in France. The Huguenots tried it, and they were stamped out by the Spanish Catholics, but they tried hard. And they were the same. They were operating under that political philosophy. And then there was, the The fourth one that is not America was the Netherlands, and it persisted actually into the 20th century. And you ought to Google Abraham Kuyper if you want to read about a Christian statesman in the modern era. And what he was doing was the same thing. A representative republic under a divine charter upheld by popular representation and balance of powers. And all later attempts have mirrored this, guys. Can you think of a modern nation that has not tried to have a constitution, a balance of powers, rights, representation? The world has been changed by this political philosophy. And all of this comes from the Bible. The type of kingdom-deferred self-representation, self-government, is Israel. And this brings me to the most important reason that you're at Candlelight. The greatest confusion about all of this today, and it is a confusion that is dividing our side politically in Kootenai County, is the role of Israel in all of this. We need to be praying for our friend Eric Metaxas, who has, as of today, I think Scott Gruber, Paul called, who's the White Rose Resistance guy? Seth Gruber. Paul called Seth Gruber because he had some questions about the whole Eric Metaxas operation, and Seth Gruber just gave Eric Metaxas Paul's number and gave Paul Eric's number. And so I think they're going to get together and have a confab, and Paul is going to try to talk to Eric about some of these issues. And it's very important because you may have noticed leading lights like Tucker Carlson asking about this pro-America resurgence and being told by today's political Calvinists about how we are going to bring the kingdom now. And the people who are saying that are almost uniformly postmillennial, supersessionist, preterist, kingdom now Christians who are also kind of quietly but truly anti-Semitic. And so in our own county, we actually have a resurgence of monarchism and anti-Semitism on our political side of the aisle. And what I would like any of our pro-America, pro-Bible, pro-God and country advocates to understand is that all of our founders were taking their cues from Jews. They were literally learning about self-government from the types that are upheld in the Bible. And this is why, back to the passage I read earlier, all of these political sermoneers were looking back to the time of the judges as the only time on earth where we have a clear political picture of how man is supposed to govern himself when God is his or her king. And you notice that the elders went to Samuel. The elders just went to the judge and they said, look, this is what we need. Well, this is a clue that this is what they were used to. Israel was self-governed by clan, by elder, clan, and tribe. And they looked to the priest and they looked to the prophet because they looked to God. And they had no king but God. And sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon from the really going all the way back to the 1620s up through the end of the Revolutionary era, the pastors were talking this way. No king but Jesus. Kingdom deferred, self-government. And so I just took a Bible passage and made it say what I wanted it to say. Maybe. But here's the point. In the church age, look, we read the New Testament, we're not going to get political theory. But in the Old Testament, we do have types, and we have a very strong pattern of types. By the way, you will say to me, well, we had monarchs. The people asked for a king, and then God gave them Saul, and then God gave them David and Solomon. Read about Solomon's reign. Solomon's reign was tribute imposed, widespread self-government with great prosperity. I'll just read you that verse, and then I'll end and have a Q&A, continue the Q&A. 1 Kings 40 kind of gives us a picture of what it was like even to be under a monarchy in Israel at its height, at probably the type that looks the most like what the millennium will be like, which will be us under the direct rule of Jesus. And it basically, I hope I got the right chapter. I don't know if I did. I did not, because this is just a typo, Sarah. Sarah is always occasionally complaining about typos, and I never do typos, but I did today. The verse I meant to put up there in 1 Kings, and maybe it's 4:20 through 25, basically makes reference to the reign of Solomon, in which every man was under his own vine and fig tree and enjoying the blessings of God. And this is really the picture. If God is our king, no man is our king. And look, this fits the church age, and this certainly fits the church age in America, because if there is a Caesar here, it is the people. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if you guys want to cut this apart somehow, or just ask me what in the blue blazes I'm talking about. Sarah.
Metaxas wrote about Bonhoeffer calling the pious but aloof German church to stand against Hitler, even to the point of plotting against Hitler. How does this translate to fighting against evil today? How far are pastors and churches supposed to go? If a Christian seizes power, isn't he a tyrant just as absolutely as the one he seized it from?
This was the question that one of the pastors at the former First Christian Church of Sandpoint asked at the lunch yesterday. And I thought it was astute. This was a gentleman who said that he had come from a family that escaped communism. And I can't remember if it was in Greece but it was somewhere in that part of Europe or near Asia. And the question basically was this: what right did a pastor have to resist evil to the point of trying to assassinate even a Hitler? So look, I wonder if I were to ask for a show of hands in this room and ask you, how many of you would actually support a plot to assassinate an evil dictator yourself? Yeah, I mean, look, if we understand what we're up against, and Eric Metaxas talked about this last night. Like, many of us looked at this last presidential election as a drowning person coming up for air. Like, this was a reprieve of life, a reprieve of societal survival, of the actual survival of our republic. And I don't think that's an overstatement. And so, look, if we had unequivocal evidence that we had a Hitler, that we had a Ceausescu, that we had a Pol Pot was it Cambodia? And we had a chance to send one of our dudes in there. I guess I won't name names, but I'm thinking of them. Sometimes you see them circling, posted at our doors at Candlelight. Combat vets, guys who, you don't want to be on their bad side. And if I had a chance to send one of those guys, Hoover, is Hoover here? He won't mind. He likes me, at least until just a minute ago. If we had a chance to send one of our guys covertly and actually send someone, as we used to say in the South, send someone to meet Jesus early, would it be wrong? Look, I think the short answer is no. But I would not want to be the one to make that decision myself. That is a heavy burden on the conscience. But let's step it back into the civil arena a little bit more. What is the duty of a pastor or a Christian to get engaged in exercising power. In other words, let me put it this way. Do we want Pastor Paul to run for president? I saw Joe DeFort shake his head very quickly, and I'm not sure why. Is that like self-serving? Like, what would happen to Candlelight if all of a sudden we also had to deal with a pastor who was also president? Because Pastor Paul would not stop being pastor of Candlelight, but he would also be the president of the United States. And man, what would life be like around here? Executive orders, that's right. Paul's going to call me any minute. He's going to text me, or he's just going to tell Jason to shut down the live stream. There he is. All I'm doing is speculating about what if you were president of the United States.
Executive orders, that's right. Paul's going to call me. He's just going to tell Jason to shut down the live stream. Can you hear me?
I'm hearing the live stream of myself on a 5-second delay in the background. Hello?
If you can hear me, I know there's a delay, but if you can hear me, ask the congregation in response if I'm hearing the live stream of myself.
Paul, turn me down for a minute, because all they're hearing is me.
Okay. Yeah, I'm turning you down. Hold on. All right, I turned you. Can you hear?
Yep, we can hear you now. You're on the live stream and our whole Wednesday night crowd. Hi, Pastor Paul.
Hey, everybody. Sorry I'm not there. I'm starting to climb out of this hole, though. So here's the question. How many of you would be willing to lead the charge to take out Hitler if you knew that Hitler was indeed killing Jews by the scores? Would it be justifiable in a military action to take out Hitler to protect the victims of his warfare?
Yes.
I'm going to turn the sound back up my end so you can answer. I'll hang up. Love you guys.
Love you. I'm not sure what was just happening there, but I had just said the short answer is yes, but he sounded so much more decisive when he said it, and that's because he's the senior pastor.
The difference is whether there's a declaration of war or not.
All right. Fair enough, Craig, but our country has been fighting wars without declarations for, of course, at least a couple of generations, depending on how you define them. And that raises the question of top-down versus bottom-up. A declaration of war is an instance of the full operation of all top-down protocols, including Congress having to declare war. And yet, none of that was in play in Bonhoeffer's case, because who's going to declare war on Hitler? So and by the way, let me make it worse. This was a prelude to an actual revolution. One of the weird things about us talking about the American founders is that they actually were revolutionaries. And the very interesting thing about them is that none of them were warmongers. They were in a conundrum that continues to baffle my most progressive and liberal friends today, all of whom seem to think that people who carry guns and are trained with guns are violent people, and that they themselves who would never touch a gun are the most peace-loving people. In my experience with the, not really the better virtuous versions of these, but in some of the more, shall I say, loony fringe of my progressive liberal friends, the pacifist versions of them are the ones I'm most afraid of losing their temper and going nuts. Meanwhile, all the guys I know who are armed and trained and are law-abiding defenders are defenders of others, and they are truly peace-loving. And the founders were this. They were, perhaps George Washington, who was the Cincinnatus of the modern era, exemplified this by refusing to accept the dictatorship of the United States and forever stamping upon the American consciousness the right of God to rule over our people, because no man will accept that position. And that was a revolutionary act. It needed the backing of revolutionary thoughts, words, plans, and actions. And I'm not the one to say, hey, let's go, let's go turn over porta potties, or start having bricks delivered to the corners of Coeur d'Alene. When all of that stuff was happening, all the BLM stuff started happening, there were actually pallets of bricks that were delivered to Perryville, Kentucky, population like 6,000. If you think anyone believed that there were grassroots, spontaneous BLM demonstrations about to ensue in Perryville, Kentucky, I mean, this was actually, and this was happening right around the same time that then we were also told that we all needed to stay home from work and school and church and put on a mask and keep our kids off the playgrounds that were already strung with crime scene tape, because if they played on the playground, they would kill grandma. So I will admit I've thought about revolution more and more since 2020, but I know that I'm joking about something very, very serious. And I think you just heard our pastor say, yeah, if we knew unequivocally that there was a person who was systematically guilty of slaughtering innocents and we had the chance to take said person out, we would not be wrong to do so. We would indeed be 100% just to do so. And Genesis 12:3, and I'm going to have to look it up. I knew it the second before you threw it out there.
I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him if we were talking about Hitler.
Yeah, because Hitler Hitler came under that curse for sure. I mean, he actually aligned his life and his ideology with the writing of Mein Kampf. He became the apotheosis of cursing those God has blessed. And that didn't end well. Didn't end well at all. And by the way, this is why it's important. We have to help our political family in Kootenai County understand that the Jews are not our enemy. Kingdom-deferred self-government was taught to us in the Bible by God's chosen people. And that is... It's increasingly mind-blowing to me that there's an actual anti-Semitic component in mainstream Republican government today. And you may be listening to me going, no, it's not. Yes, it is. It's there. I have some of the screenshots, and Stephanie has many more. Yes, Art. Do you want a microphone, Art?
I got one right here. I'll try to speak loud.
We need a mic for the live stream. I think Mitch has one.
Thank you. My question is, what happened to the pastors? We had 350 years of apparently an understanding of the Golden Triangle and the book and fire and brimstone and hours of sermons and everything. And then suddenly, was it Johnson with his IRS ruling suppressing the speech of pastors, or did the pastors stop being educated in the Golden Triangle? Did they forget the kingdom deferred self-government? What happened?
I think it is some of all of that and maybe a couple of things more. Let me just back up and try to hit it my own way. If the question is what happened, we can track it a little bit. By the time we get to the Wilson era, you've got a softening of the edge the political edge of Christianity that is happening at the same time as a hardening of the political edge of secular society. And that was perhaps exemplified most by the Wilson administration and his favorite educator, John Dewey. And if you do a little bit of reading about the founder of the Dewey Decimal System, you'll find out that he was the ideological arm behind the government strongman Woodrow Wilson, who himself was a pastor's son, if I remember correctly, and became the agent of essentially what I now believe is an antichrist drive in American culture. And he was indeed, both of those guys, I believe, were satanically, if not directly demonically inspired to take advantage of an opening left in the public culture by which it seemed like, okay, the church has been carrying this burden for a while. Families have been carrying this burden for a while. We're wealthy. Do I need to interrupt myself, Sarah? Okay, she's just making sure I don't forget that she's there and she has questions. I'm not as smooth as I ought to be all the time from the platform up here, but I'm still learning. Wilson and Dewey essentially took secularism and elitism into the gap vacated by Christians. That's a short version of what happened. And I think at the beginning, I think my grandparents were exemplars of this. They believed that you could trust the educational system, and they believed that you could trust the president. My grandmother and granddaddy were saved as young 20-somethings in Oklahoma City during the 40s. And they were God and country Americans. They became staunch believers and devoutly non-political. And so I came up among the mantra, don't talk about religion or politics in polite company. And the only one who was really allowed to do that was the preacher. And even the preacher could only do that with a joke and a wink, because you still had to make friends and bring in the people and pack the building with bodies and meet the budget. And so I can remember that being the mindset as long as I've been alive, which is since 1969. And I think it started at the beginning of the 19th century to really take hold, and it was a frog in the kettle. It just happened so slowly. Thankfully, we have had pastors waking us up. The first time I remember hearing a pastor say, you can tell your people how to vote. The only person who said you couldn't was this guy named Johnson, and it wasn't even a law. That was 2009, I heard that, or 2007. And from then on, I haven't been the same. I actually sent one of my I'm telling you how to vote sermons when I was such a pastor. I sent it to the IRS. Haven't heard a thing. So, Sarah, question.
I missed last night. Can you elaborate on this golden triangle you're talking about?
I can't, because I said everything I remember, and I think I got it wrong. Did I get it right? I don't have much to elaborate. The golden triangle is just it's basically a way to describe, it's not a golden list. A list would just be faith, virtue, freedom. It's a triangle because they are not sequential. They are revolving and rotating, and they're interlocking, and they're connected, and they all affect each other. And if you pull one, you disable the other two. So, and I think it's correct. I think it might leave some things out, and it might need some elaboration. But Os Guinness is not to be trifled with. I mean, he's probably describing that correctly. But basically, the idea is that we can think about it this way. You can see in the Islamic world or in the secularist post-Christian European world, or even in the Orthodox Russian world replaced by by satanic atheistic communism and post-communist Russia. You can see in all of those cultures efforts to try to have virtue and faith without freedom, or virtue and freedom without faith, or any combination of the two, and you can identify where it broke down. And it really is, I think, accurate that in the United States, at least in its founding, as well as in the 4 prior attempts that I've mentioned, they end up with this golden triangle, but it is derived from the Bible by these Calvinist, libertarian, political, biblical philosophers. So I don't know if that's, without any more clarity on the question, I don't know how to hit it, but there's 3 minutes. Yeah, Craig.
So over the years, I think I've watched the production called The Truth Project on 3 or 4 separate occasions.
It's good.
And I think I heard Oz Guinness narrating part of that. Show me where in the book of Isaiah, chapter 33 and verse 22, I'll give you a second to get there. The reason I bring it up is because I've had discussions with friends that will try to tell me that our country was not based on Judeo-Christian principles. And yet, it's clear right there. It gives the 3 branches of government spelled out in Isaiah from God to us. And that is where our founding fathers got that. And I just think a lot of people don't even know what's in the Bible.
Yeah, that's true. I'll read it. Isaiah 33:22, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. And that is indeed the judicial, legislative, and executive branch. That's not the only place that these are laid out. And Craig, you're right to cite this as an example of what really is an ocean, an avalanche of biblical thought and language that actually ends up coalescing into the exact formulations that we see in our own political culture. I'll just cite one example. If you look up the Mecklenburg Declaration, you'll find out that it is disputed but not entirely disputable that Thomas Jefferson had at his hand when he was writing the Declaration of Independence a declaration from the elders of Mecklenburg County, Virginia, I think it was, or it might have been North Carolina. I should know my Appalachian states, but in this case, Mecklenburg has eluded me for a minute. But it is the Mecklenburg Declaration, and it was penned by, I think it was 29 church elders declaring the independence of that commonwealth from Great Britain as a state. And it is, if you read it, if you start reading the Mecklenburg Declaration, it's a couple of things are very clear. They're deriving it from Scripture. That's number one. It's like they have the Bible in their hands and they're writing a pre-King Saul, Judges era declaration of their right to be ruled by God alone. And if you see that laid next to the actual Declaration of Independence, you think, well, one of these guys was copying the other. And the Mecklenburg Declaration is chronologically ahead of the Declaration of Independence. Blackstone's commentaries on English law, Montesquieu's writings and political theory, if they weren't quoting the Bible, they were quoting those two things, which also in turn were saturated in the Bible. And there's a book called The Christian Character of American Life and Government. And I think the guy's name is Morris, John Morris. You ought to look that up. It's another big fat book that you can use to weight the back of your pickup in a snowstorm. But it's also worth looking at because you'll see a compendium of evidence that culturally, philosophically, politically, America has always been Judeo-Christian in its core. It's only disputable by people who haven't done their reading. So, all right, I guess it's about that time. I'm 1 minute over. The natives don't look too restless. Do I have time to do a closing prayer? Is that okay? All right. Let's stand up where we are, and thank you for being patient with my rants tonight. Pastor Paul will be back next Wednesday night to correct all of this, line by line. Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for my church family and my compatriots in this time of readiness. Perhaps not full-blown revolution, but readiness to stand, readiness to serve, and readiness to advance against tyranny, against evil, against darkness, and against sin. Lord, I pray that you would enable us to, in a libertarian way, but also a fully Christ-like and obedient way, stand for you. And we pray and believe in Jesus' name. Amen.